The year was 1995. I was a wee little baby, and one of the greatest landmark titles of not only the decade, but of all time was released. But enough about Jumping Flash, because another important game released around then, and that would be Chrono Trigger. It became an instant classic, and in the West at least, its late Super Nintendo release schedule meant it was a favourite among the burgeoning, but still ultimately niche role-playing game community. And as the PlayStation 1 saw the genre finally hit the mainstream globally, Chrono Trigger saw another release, which meant everyone could finally play what was already by then a certified classic. Then there were the players in the bits of the world that Squaresoft, the developers of Chrono Trigger, seemed to hate immensely. We didn't see an official release of Chrono Trigger until 2009 on the Nintendo DS. Though really everyone had already played it, because emulating SNES was very easy, and for legal reasons I want to clarify that obviously me and my family in the early 2000s had dumped legally purchased North American SNES cartridges onto our family computer, and nothing sinister happened. It's snowing, that's weird. But I barely played it then. It didn't grab me, but also playing a Super Nintendo game on a computer keyboard wasn't ideal, especially with games I didn't know like the back of my hand. In retrospect, this was a mistake, but I'm glad it meant that I didn't properly tackle Chrono Trigger until I was old enough to really appreciate it, and that's now. I've known of this game for 2 decades, had ample opportunity to play it, including not only the DS version that I could have bought when it was affordable, or the PC version, which is actually good now, I swear, but 18-year-old me even bought the iPhone version a decade ago, and it sure was fun to buy a game, play it for 5 minutes, and then never open it again. But I'm 28, it's 2022 AD, and I finally played the game that people have spent almost my entire life telling me to play. And you know what? It's pretty good. And obviously I chose to play the DS version, because I just need to justify buying a used copy off eBay for multiple times its original retail price. Just don't judge me, please. The Nintendo DS loved to feed off nostalgia. Obviously the new Super Mario Bros. Game started here, because Nintendo could smell old people money, but we got so many ports and full remakes of games from the 90s, it was a no-brainer to release one of the most popular games of all time here to this system. They'd already remade Resident Evil for this thing, so why not Chrono Trigger? Though it's a very faithful port of what came before, in particular the PlayStation release, which had all sorts of bells and whistles like a bestiary and an art viewer. The obvious change for us in the West is the DS version saw a new localization, though the original couple English releases were still good in that regard, so you can't go wrong either way. In fact, a lot of people love the original localization so much and they just can't enjoy this new script. Though both are still good, even if this one's frog isn't quite as appealing as the one of old. The DS release has a lot to call its own, and is to many seen as the definitive release. So you can't go wrong with either version, except maybe the mobile version, which is uglier, but hey, the core game is still good under that mess. The core game is about Chrono, a typical protagonist of the era. He is a teenager who lives in a 1-bedroom home with his mum, because she can just sleep on the floor with the cat. It's 1000 AD, and the Millenial Fair is being held, which obviously means gambling, drinking contests, and knocking strangers to the ground. But with his new friends in tow, and his old friend just tinkering with inventions, this trio accidentally discover a form of time travel, and with this they can visit the past, the future, and okay, well that's it. But their exploring through time reveals a lot, including the near destruction of a planet in 1999 AD, and what's left of humanity in a barren, hopeless future. So this trio, with the help of some others they picked up along the way from different time periods, need to save the future world and put an end to the thing that's causing it, which is rooted deep in the planet's past. The cast of characters are an eclectic bunch. We have a talking frog, a talking robot, and a talking woman, who each bring their own unique perspectives to this threat years in the making. And best of all, these guys all synergize in interesting ways that makes combat a blast to experiment with, even if most of the footage here shows me not experimenting, because I like what I like. But on an intellectual level, I love what was done here. The combat is surprisingly good, and deserves time for me to properly gush about it. but it takes a while to properly experience it because the start is not short, and it's there we get a good idea of how the other pillars of the game work. We have an overworld free from enemy encounters, and various towns scattered across the landscape. Though instead of entering them directly, we just get to mosey over to whichever buildings we're allowed into from the zoomed out map. Usually it's just an inn, a store, and some houses with NPCs to talk to, so we get concentrated goodness without much meandering between buildings. This helps keep the pace up significantly, as we'll be walking these continents most of the game, and there's a lot of land to cover with all these different time periods. The periods in question are 65 million BC, 12,000 BC, 600 AD, 1000 AD, and 2300 AD. Each has an incredibly distinct tone and look which really sells the journey. And since our grab bag of party members are from these times, it gives them much more impact than just bumbling through without a proper connection. I will support any time period where Frog is from. The music is also atmospheric and suitable. This is what 600 AD would sound like, trust me. The dungeons of the game aren't the most enjoyable thing, unfortunately. Some are tedious and the rest are just kind of forgettable, but they do at least each feel unique and match the eras wonderfully. The best of these from that perspective are the futuristic ones of the 21st century, which will have computers and passwords to worry about on top of everything else. And at the very least, it's fitting that the Ocean Palace of Antiquity is tedious to get through, because I wouldn't put it past the people who built this in-universe to be the worst people imaginable. These dungeons have interactable elements which you just sort of need to learn. In my first playthrough, I was stuck in the beginning until I realized the way forward meant interacting with these skulls that I thought were just decorative. But it's a once you know thing. It doesn't become an issue after you first understand what you're meant to do. In a way, this was corrected in later releases like Mobile and Steam, which give you a big, obvious interactive marker, which is a quality of life improvement for sure, but it doesn't ruin the core. Most dungeons are pretty straightforward, they're all just kind of there. And for players on the DS or later re-releases, they're all just there again, because of the exclusive content, which is mostly just recycled rooms but laid out in a unique way. Now I know where the remake of Link's Awakening got its idea from. But credit where credit's due, these really annoying, tedious, filler, extra content dungeons do have a couple of unique elements, and one in particular was actually really good and I wish it was in the main game. There's a section where our playable trio get locked in a room, and the rest of the gang need to rescue them, so they get their own exclusive mini part of a dungeon, where we have to play as the characters in reserve. Hey, that's fun. It's not amazing, but since no one ever plays this filler content, and it's only ever described as recycled rooms, I'll give it the little bit of credit it deserves. Other than that brief exception, all the game's dungeons are pretty standard, with only the bosses being the highlight, and oh boy are they highlights. They follow save points which are able to fully restore health and magic if a shelter item is expended. These are cheap and stackable single-use items, which not only mean you shouldn't need to backtrack out of a dungeon to restore those values, you can go wild with magic during regular encounters without ever feeling punished. And it most importantly allows the bosses to be complicated and unforgiving at times. Probably why they decided to make the end of the game just be nothing but bosses, even after they wore out their welcome. The combat of Chrono Trigger uses an active time battle system where you can only perform actions like attacking once a character's bar has filled up, and the speed of this can be adjusted in the settings. Would recommend cranking it up to the top once you're comfortable with everything, but slow and steady is a nice way to learn the ropes or each character's own niches with much less stress. There's also an option to set it to a less active system, and this is a nice option to some people even if most people just want what is considered the default. As it stands, it's a frenzy of getting your attacks in and hoping the enemy doesn't do the same, but with the added depth of combo techniques. Each character has their own singular tech, which is just this game's version of special attacks, magic, or whatever other word you want to use, and these are obviously performed at the cost of magic. However, different character combinations have their own double or triple techs, and this can play a big part in how you want to plan your party, and these in turn require you expend MP for all the characters involved, and have all their bars filled. It can mean holding off on an attack and just waiting for a second or third party member to catch up, but it's often worth it. For example, Frog and Ayla can do individual heals, but combined they can heal the whole party. Or both Chrono and Luca can team up for a really devastating attack that benefits from Luca's element of fire and Chrono's sort of being powerful. There are lots of these, and it's a wrinkle the combat really needed to go from just good to really good. But it goes much further than that and becomes really, really good. This is most often seen in the bosses, but it does show up in regular fodder too. Strategy is often required here, because these enemies don't mess around if you make careless choices. For example, some may halve your current HP if you attack them with the wrong kind of attack, or they may be healed by your attack instead. Some of these fights get really tense as you have to plan around what you can do, and spamming attacks that can hit every enemy of a party with different variables can blow up in your face, even if it's fun to see a giant frog attack everyone. Some enemies will only be harmed by all attacks if they're first hit with their weakness to temporarily lower their defenses, and the bosses love having assistants that heal or resurrect them. The character's positioning is also important since some attacks are only usable against enemies close by, and they may be entirely unusable in certain situations. The only issue I have with the combat is some of the attack animations take a little too long and slow down the pace, and some of the others do hurt my eyes a little, like the constant flashing ones. And later bosses like the very last one escalate to deliver some of the most memorable encounters of the genre. I won't ever forget that final boss, but that's also because the game made me revisit it so many damn times. Part of this is helped with Akira Toriyama's art being on full display, and he really delivered some of his best work here. Even if I personally prefer the cuter and rounder stuff of his, I can't deny just how great these all turned out to be. Look at that dinosaur spinning around and tell me this isn't great. The art as a whole is perhaps some of the best of a Super Nintendo, and it didn't lose anything by being on the DS. Everything is so detailed here, with the absolute most standout examples being things like the sky and water and various backgrounds across the place. It's just breathtaking. This shouldn't be possible, but they found a way. The only problem is sometimes things are a little too detailed. You have a lot of foreground elements, or in some areas higher terrain, that blocks the view, and you kind of have to work your way around obstacles you can't properly see, with characters you can't see either. And whoever designed this really narrow hallway in the future sewers is evil. Thankfully this does lead into my favourite change of this dual screen re-release, the dual screens. Whenever we're just walking around, there's a really handy map, and this is basically exclusive to this release. It fills in automatically when in dungeons, and in the overworld it shows us the locations of towns. This is a small quality of life improvement, one that isn't worth bragging about really, but it is one that's missed after you don't have it anymore. But it's just helpful enough, and it helps keep this version in my heart. Other menu options are set to the bottom screen, which makes everything a breeze to go through. The menus have been cleaned up and are just easier to read, and we have dedicated shortcuts here, which is the cherry on top. And during battles, you can set the UI to appear on the bottom for a less cluttered experience, or you can keep it traditional if you want that as well. And it helps future-proof this game, because people who aren't me would like to record only a single screen of the game, since that's all you need. But I went for the newer one just because it felt so much more intuitive to me personally, and it can still be operated with the D-pad and buttons, so you're not forced to touch everything if you just want more room for everything else. But if you want to, you can operate the entire game with just the stylus. All your attacks are pretty easy to understand. The new menu is basically built for that, but we can also move the stylus on the bottom screen to move our characters across the map. This is pretty pointless, but like if all the buttons fall off your Nintendo DS and you still want to play Chrono Trigger on it, you can. It's a fun novelty, even if it gets annoying after a minute. But hey, I won't complain about a fun novelty option, I live for those. It's not any worse for its inclusion, and the second screen is a nice bonus. It'd be weird if it wasn't interactable with a stylus. And my favourite pointless feature in the genre is here. You have multiple colour options for the text box and menu backgrounds here. There is nothing to fault with the core here on a first playthrough. At worst, things just get not super fun, but it's bolstered by a story that is one of the best out there. Even now, some don't think it's been topped. And while I personally wouldn't go that far, I'm not going to give examples just so I can lessen the amount of hate directed at me. But I still recognise how revolutionary this is, especially to players back in 1995. RPG stories were definitely out of their growing pains by this stage, a lot of the great ones had already happened in this time. But this does outdo pretty much the entire genre, and for North American audiences it's even easier to see why this stuck out so much to them, since most of Japan's best weren't brought over yet. Meanwhile, us PAL players were just in the dark ages, waiting for Lufia to come out on Super Nintendo in 1997. The story is still that good, and it makes perfect use out of a time travel to deliver the most it can. There are lots of twists and turns that are probably completely spoiled to most, but I avoided them for all these years, so I was able to be taken aback by later plot points. On top of the actual dramatic moments, we get to do silly little things like change an entire family's greed to generosity by giving someone's ancestor something for free 400 years earlier. The side content later in the game really drives home the fun time travel antics you can have. I won't fault the story in any way, except just to say Magus is just Sorrow from Dragon Quest IV again, but hey, I won't blame them for copying the edgy villain. It's a nice trope and it's better executed here since we have a lot more characterization for my edgy little guy. But this is just because I'm physically incapable of complimenting Squaresoft without also showing my Enix bias. Chrono Trigger's writing is certainly dramatic and well plotted, but what really caught me off guard is the humour. A lot of it plays off already established tropes of the genre, and I love it. Every second Ozzy is on screen is my favourite part of the game. Usually when people say they laughed at something, I think they're exaggerating because I'm an emotionless robot as my voice indicates. But I actually audibly made a slight chuckle at a few scenes before diligently writing them down in my list of notes like any other fun-loving human. My first playthrough was just about me loving the gameplay, the graphics, and basically all the fluff around the core. But it did feel overhyped initially. But then, for my replays, this entirely flipped. Those saw me loving the multi-layered story with a lot of foreshadowing and fun gags I missed, like meeting the developers. Wait, they think Final Fantasy IV is hard? Why? Oh, wait, yeah, never mind. They're right. But this new appreciation was held back by the freshly introduced, but not perfected, New Game Plus. Chrono Trigger seemed to invent the moniker, and while similar things did technically precede it, like multiple game second quests, or Lufia 2's retry mode, this was still the early days, and hindsight wasn't yet there. Starting a new game with previous stats and weapons means combat is just meaningless, and while some encounters are avoidable, many aren't and they just make the long animations hurt more. Once again, hindsight. I can see why the SNES original didn't have this sorted, but an option to make encounters with underlevel monsters instantly finish would have been great for this re-release that wasn't afraid to change things up. The mobile and Steam versions even added an auto battle option, which increases the speed so you can both not think and get things over with much quicker, and that's a better option than nothing. This does leave the DS version lacking. This is just the original game, with most tweaks being an edited interface or extra content no one seems to like. The biggest improvements here are the map, and you can even run by default so you no longer need to hold a button in, so you can say play a game while eating a pizza with the other hand or something. But this is barely a feature to most people, since pretty much everyone that isn't me does not mind holding in a run button. The extra content this release has to flaunt over the SNES original are things like animated cutscenes or the bestiary, which the PlayStation re-release already had, though it is nice to have it without the load times. The animated cutscenes are entirely optional here, which isn't a thing going forward in later releases. I like them, but it is silly to have some moments play out as both animated scenes and in-game animation with sprites, so I get the appeal of turning these off wherever possible, even if I won't. And I just need to mention it, the phone and Steam versions have diagonal overworld movement, which is not a big deal in the slightest, but that's the kind of needless feature I enjoy, and frankly, I need to get something out of myself playing the beginning of this game across so many different platforms. It wasn't worth it. I need to complement the diagonal movement so I don't feel like I've wasted my time. I don't think there is a definitive Chrono Trigger release. I've seen arguments from all sides. Some love the original flavour of everything the most, and I can't blame them. And the Steam version with the right tweaks is certainly a great alternative, even if it didn't appear so because it released abysmally. But this DS version is the most complete version, and it's unparalleled in terms of options thanks to the 2-screen setup. It's uncompromised and fully featured, and the worst aspects of it are completely optional segments no one is forcing you to play unless you really want more Chrono Cross fan service. I'm glad I played this, and I can see the appeal of Chrono Trigger. Personally, it's not my favourite game, or RPG, or Super Nintendo title ever. There are some bits like the ending that drag on for me personally. But there are plenty of games I love that have pacing issues or slow down to a crawl. But the difference is, Chrono Trigger is competing with my memories as like a 6-year-old, and Chrono Trigger just can't win. Chrono Trigger deserves to be loved and heralded as one of the best games ever, even if for me it's just in the really, really, really good camp. Oh, and something Terranigma? I don't know, this somehow became a debate online even if the games are nothing alike and very hard to compare, and everyone makes them fight because a clock motif in the opening seconds of both is enough to make them mortal enemies or something. Chrono Trigger wins because it doesn't have Christopher Columbus being a really nice guy. Chrono Trigger won, I don't hate it, I like it a lot, and in this one instance it defeated my childhood nostalgia.